This is a subtle beginning of corruption, not dramatic cruelty, but adjustment. The powerful individual does not declare themselves above right and wrong. Instead, they reinterpret right and wrong within the framework of necessity. They tell themselves that their responsibilities demand flexibility. Harsh decisions are reframed as burdens reluctantly carried. Actions that would once have been condemned are now described as unavoidable. Conscience, rather than forbidding the act, is persuaded to tolerate it. A critical transformation occurs when harm is reclassified. In ordinary life, causing suffering to another person feels personal. It is seen in faces, heard in voices, sensed in atmosphere. But power creates distance. Decisions are implemented through systems, policies, intermediaries. The connection between choice and consequence becomes indirect. Because the powerful do not witness every effect personally, the emotional weight diminishes. Harm becomes abstract. It becomes a statistic, a necessary adjustment, a strategic trade-off. Conscience relies upon immediacy. When suffering is immediate and visible, moral resistance intensifies. When suffering is distant and diffused, moral resistance weakens. The powerful mind begins to speak in terms of outcomes rather than individuals. It calculates benefits for the many and justifies losses among the few. The language of sacrifice enters the narrative. Those who are harmed are described as unfortunate, but required for stability or progress. Through this reasoning, conscience is not silenced but reshaped. It is convinced that harm, under certain conditions, is morally acceptable. Another dimension of corrupted conscience is gradual desensitization. The first compromise often feels uncomfortable. The second feels less so. By the third, the act begins to feel routine. Human psychology adapts quickly to repeated behavior. What once disturbed the inner voice becomes familiar. Familiarity reduces emotional intensity. The powerful individual may remember a time when they would have hesitated longer, but the present demands efficiency. Conscience adjusts to speed. Reflection shortens. Justification accelerates. There is also a shift in identity. Power encourages a belief that one embodies a greater purpose. Leaders often view themselves as custodians of order, protectors of institutions, architects of direction. When identity merges with mission, personal morality becomes subordinate to perceived necessity. The individual convinces themselves that their unique position grants them insight others lack. From this vantage point, ordinary moral constraints appear simplistic. The powerful begin to see themselves not as bound by common rules, but as interpreters of higher ones. In this mindset, conscience transforms from a restraining voice into a managerial one. It no longer asks, "Is this right?" but rather, "Is this effective?" It evaluates optics, stability, long-term influence. The ethical question becomes intertwined with strategic calculation. The powerful individual may still believe they are moral, yet their definition of morality now centers on preservation of control and achievement of objectives. Corruption of conscience rarely presents itself as wickedness. It presents itself as pragmatism. The individual speaks of complexity, of burdens others cannot understand. They emphasize the weight of responsibility, suggesting that difficult choices are misunderstood by those who do not share their vantage point. In doing so, they insulate themselves further from critique. Each defense strengthens the internal narrative that their actions, however harsh, are justified by circumstance. Over time, the inner voice that once warned against causing harm grows quieter, not because it has been extinguished, but because it has been retrained. It has learned to prioritize order over empathy, preservation over principle, success over restraint. What began as minor adaptation becomes structural transformation. The conscience still exists, but it now serves the architecture of power rather than standing apart from it. This separation dulls emotional immediacy. It becomes easier to evaluate outcomes abstractly when one is not confronted with the trembling voice of those affected. As emotional immediacy fades, justification grows. Decisions that produce harm can be defended through abstraction. One speaks of systems, structures, long-term necessity. The individual impact dissolves into collective language. When one does not witness pain directly, the moral weight of causing it feels lighter. Distance softens conscience. The mind begins to emphasize intention over effect, vision over consequence. There is also a psychological loneliness embedded in power. True companionship requires equality, yet authority complicates equality. Even friendships shift under hierarchy. The powerful may question whether affection is genuine or strategic. This uncertainty fosters guardedness. Guardedness reduces vulnerability. And without vulnerability, empathy weakens further. The leader becomes surrounded, yet alone. In this solitude, self-reflection can either deepen or distort. Often, without honest voices nearby, it distorts. Within isolation, justification becomes a companion. It fills the silence left by absent critics. The mind rehearses its own righteousness. It recalls past successes as evidence of superior judgment. It frames criticism, when it does appear, as envy or ignorance. Each narrative reinforces the self-image of necessity. The individual convinces themselves that their perspective is uniquely comprehensive. Others, lacking the same vantage point, simply cannot understand the burdens of command. This belief in exclusive understanding intensifies moral reinterpretation. If one sees more than others, then one's choices must be wiser. If one carries greater responsibility, then harsher measures appear proportionate. Isolation thus transforms authority into a kind of moral solitude. The powerful person begins to view themselves not merely as decision-maker, but as custodian of order. In this role, personal doubts are suppressed because doubt threatens stability. Confidence becomes not only preference, but duty. Furthermore, isolation reduces exposure to ordinary limitation. The daily inconveniences that shape humility, waiting, negotiating, compromising, fade. Processes accelerate around authority. Doors open more easily. Obstacles are removed swiftly. This altered environment reshapes expectation. The powerful grow accustomed to compliance. Resistance, when encountered, feels abnormal. What would once have been considered legitimate disagreement now appears as disruption. Justification arises quickly to neutralize it. Over time, the psychological effect of isolation compounds. The individual becomes increasingly enclosed within their own reasoning. External voices sound distant, even intrusive. The mind, deprived of authentic contradiction, grows certain of its moral narrative. Each decision reinforces a structure of self-belief. Each unchallenged action strengthens the assumption of correctness. What begins as subtle separation evolves into a worldview in which authority and virtue are intertwined. Isolation does not always feel oppressive to the one who experiences it. It can feel serene, orderly, efficient. Yet beneath that calm lies a narrowing of perspective. Without genuine dialogue, the capacity to question oneself weakens. And when self-questioning fades, justification becomes instinctive. The powerful individual no longer asks whether their interpretation is fair. They assume it is. The silence around them becomes proof, and the absence of resistance becomes moral endorsement. The corruption of conscience. Conscience does not disappear when power is acquired. It transforms. In the ordinary individual, conscience operates as an internal restraint shaped by vulnerability. One hesitates before causing harm because one understands, from lived experience, what harm feels like. Fear of consequence reinforces empathy. Social equality reinforces mutual recognition. But when power elevates a person above ordinary vulnerability, the structure that supports conscience begins to shift. It does not collapse suddenly. It adapts to new conditions. Power alters the relationship between action and repercussion. For most people, wrongdoing carries immediate risk. There are legal penalties, social rejection, loss of livelihood. These consequences strengthen the voice of conscience. They give it urgency. Yet when authority shields an individual from such outcomes, the warning signals lose intensity. If punishment is unlikely, If criticism is muted, the internal resistance that once felt strong becomes negotiable. The mind begins to weigh morality not as an absolute boundary, but as a variable consideration. It begins to stretch. It begins to test the boundaries of its reach. With each successful assertion of control, the will grows bolder. It learns that resistance can be overcome, that opposition can be silenced, that environments can be shaped according to preference. In this environment, reason becomes increasingly instrumental. It does not question whether the desire itself is justified. It calculates how best to fulfill it. The powerful individual often believes their decisions are rational because they can articulate explanations for them. They can present data, construct arguments, and outline strategic benefits. But the presence of explanation does not prove the presence of impartiality. The mind is extraordinarily skilled at constructing coherent narratives after desire has already chosen direction. One wants expansion, and reason supplies economic justification. One wants dominance, and reason frames it as stability. One wants to eliminate critics, and reason describes it as protecting unity. The will speaks first in silent preference, and reason follows with eloquent defense. This dynamic intensifies because power reduces external correction. When an ordinary person justifies selfish behavior, social feedback often interrupts the illusion. Friends challenge, institutions restrain, consequences follow. But authority shields the individual from such interruptions. Those who depend on the powerful are less likely to confront them. Advisors become cautious. Subordinates become agreeable. In such an atmosphere, the justifications constructed by reason go untested. They circulate within an echo chamber of affirmation. Over time, repetition transforms justification into conviction. The will also seeks preservation. Once a person acquires power, the instinct to maintain it becomes intertwined with identity. Authority is no longer merely a role. It becomes part of the self-concept. To lose power feels like diminishment, even erasure. Thus, the will attaches itself to survival within hierarchy. Actions that protect influence appear virtuous because they protect the self. Reason then reframes self-preservation as responsibility. One convinces oneself that maintaining control is necessary for the greater good. The distinction between personal interest and collective welfare begins to blur. In this state, moral principles risk becoming conditional. They are upheld when they align with desire and reinterpreted when they obstruct it. A commitment to fairness persists until fairness threatens advantage. A devotion to honesty remains until honesty risks exposure. The powerful mind does not perceive this as hypocrisy. It perceives it as adaptation. It calls flexibility wisdom. It calls compromise realism. The will's demand for continuity quietly reshapes the moral landscape, and reason diligently smooths the terrain. There is also a psychological pleasure in believing one's will is rational. It allows the powerful to see themselves not as driven by impulse, but as guided by clarity. This self-image reinforces authority. If one believes one's desires are aligned with logic and necessity, then opposition appears not only inconvenient but irrational. Critics are dismissed as emotional, uninformed, or naive. The possibility that one's own will is a true source of distortion rarely enters awareness because reason has already built protective walls around it. Over time, the integration of will and reason becomes so seamless that the individual cannot distinguish between wanting something and believing it is right. The two sensations merge. Desire feels like insight. Preference feels like principle. The capacity for self-doubt weakens because doubt threatens the coherence of the narrative reason has constructed. To question one's motives would require dismantling the architecture that supports identity and authority. Power therefore reveals an uncomfortable truth about human psychology, that rationality is often retrospective. Decisions are made in the silent chamber of impulse, and arguments are assembled afterward. When power magnifies the scope of action, it magnifies the consequences of this inner structure. The stronger the will, and the fewer the restraints, the more persuasive reason becomes in defending what it already desires. Isolation breeds justification. Power does not only elevate a person above others in rank, it separates them in experience. The higher one rises, the fewer remain who speak without calculation. Authority builds distance quietly. At first, the change feels like respect. Conversations become more careful. Words are chosen with greater caution. Disagreement is softened or postponed. Gradually, honesty becomes filtered through fear, ambition, or dependence. What once was open friction becomes polished agreement. The powerful individual may interpret this harmony as proof of wisdom, unaware that it is often the silence of restraint. Isolation alters the inner climate of judgment. When a person lives among equals, contradiction acts as a mirror. Others reflect flaws, challenge assumptions, and expose blind spots. This friction can be uncomfortable, yet it preserves balance. Without it, the mind drifts unchecked. Authority reduces the number of authentic mirrors. Advisors may present information, but they often adjust its tone. Subordinates may comply, but they rarely confront. Over time, the powerful person hears fewer genuine objections. The absence of challenge begins to feel like confirmation. In such an environment, self-trust expands. Confidence grows not because insight deepens, but because resistance diminishes. The individual begins to equate lack of opposition with correctness. When no one openly disputes a decision, it appears validated. Yet this validation is hollow. It is born of distance, not agreement. The echo of one's own reasoning returns amplified, mistaken for universal assent. Isolation also changes emotional perception. Those in power are frequently shielded from the raw consequences of their actions. Complaints are managed by intermediaries. Failures are reframed in reports. Human distress is summarized in statistics. The leader may read of suffering, but rarely sits within it. What if the greatest danger of power is not what it allows people to do, but what it allows them to believe? Have you ever wondered why leaders who once spoke of justice slowly begin to excuse cruelty? Why those who once despised corruption begin to defend it when they rise high enough? The problem we are solving today is this: why does power change a person's sense of right and wrong? And more importantly, can one hold power without losing moral clarity? Tonight, we enter the darker chamber of human psychology, where conscience trembles under the weight of authority. Power distorts moral vision. Power does not immediately corrupt. It first alters perception. The most subtle transformation it brings is not in action but in sight. A person who rises above others in authority begins to see the world from a height where consequences appear smaller and opposition appears unreasonable. When one stands among equals, morality is shaped by friction. Disagreement forces reflection. Resistance invites reconsideration. The presence of others with equal voice acts as a constant correction. But when power elevates an individual beyond ordinary contradiction, this corrective tension weakens. Without resistance, the mind grows certain of itself. Certainty is intoxicating. It feels like clarity, yet it often conceals distortion. The powerful individual begins to interpret events not as shared realities, but as extensions of their own will. What obstructs their plans becomes irrational. What supports their desires becomes justified. The moral compass does not vanish. It tilts. Actions once judged harsh begin to appear necessary. Words once considered manipulative are redefined as strategic. The internal vocabulary shifts quietly. No dramatic confession occurs, no conscious decision to abandon principle. Instead, perception bends gradually, and with it, judgment. The distortion arises because power changes a relationship between desire and consequence. For the ordinary person, wrongdoing carries immediate cost: social disapproval, material punishment, loss of reputation. These consequences reinforce moral boundaries. But power buffers consequence. It cushions impact. It creates distance between action and accountability. When punishment becomes unlikely, the psychological weight of moral restriction grows lighter. The will, relieved of fear, expands. And as desire expands, reason reorganizes itself around it. Reason, in such moments, does not resist a will. It serves it. It constructs narratives that preserve self-image. A leader who silences dissent convinces themselves it protects unity. An authority who exploits labor convinces themselves it sustains productivity. Each reinterpretation preserves the illusion of righteousness. The powerful rarely perceive themselves as unjust. They perceive themselves as pragmatic. In their mind, morality has not been abandoned. It has matured, refined, adjusted to reality. But this adjustment is a distortion itself. Another aspect of moral vision altered by power is empathy. Equality nurtures empathy because vulnerability is shared. One recognizes pain in others because one recognizes it in oneself. But power reduces vulnerability. It surrounds the individual with protection, privilege, insulation. Gradually, the powerful forget the texture of helplessness. They forget the humiliation of being unheard. Without these memories alive and sharp, the suffering of others becomes theoretical. It is understood intellectually but not felt internally. When empathy thins, moral evaluations shift from human experience to abstract outcome. Decisions become calculations. Harm becomes collateral. The face of the injured disappears behind numerical summaries. From a distance, suffering shrinks. It is easier to justify a harsh policy when one does not hear the trembling voice it silences. Distance does not merely separate physically, it reshapes emotionally. And with emotional reshaping comes moral reinterpretation. Power also alters how one interprets opposition. In ordinary life, disagreement can be tolerated because it poses limited threat. But for the powerful, opposition threatens stability, influence, and identity. Thus, critics are no longer perceived as alternative thinkers but as obstacles. The moral category of wrong shifts from injustice to disobedience. To defy authority becomes, in the mind of the authority, inherently immoral. Loyalty becomes virtue not because it is ethical, but because it is stabilizing. This psychological shift is rarely conscious. It unfolds through repeated reinforcement. Each successful exertion of control strengthens a belief in one's correctness. Each unchallenged decision reinforces self-trust. Over time, self-trust becomes self-certainty, and self-certainty becomes moral authority. The individual no longer consults external principles. They consult their own judgment as a final standard. In this state, moral vision narrows. Complexity fades. Ambiguity becomes inconvenient. The powerful prefer clarity because clarity legitimizes decisive action. Yet moral life is rarely clear. It is tangled, uncertain, nuanced. When power demands swift decisions, nuance is sacrificed. And in sacrificing nuance, one sacrifices part of morality itself. The distortion is not dramatic but cumulative. A slight justification today becomes a larger one tomorrow. A small compromise grows into structural behavior. Each step feels minor, almost invisible. But over time, the entire landscape of right and wrong has shifted. The individual still believes they are moral. They still speak of justice. They still defend their integrity. Yet their definitions have subtly aligned with their interests. Power does not demand that a person abandon morality. It merely invites them to redefine it. And redefinition, repeated often enough, becomes belief. The will over reason. Human beings take comfort in the belief that they are guided by reason. They imagine themselves weighing evidence, considering consequences, and arriving at conclusions through calm deliberation. Yet beneath this polished surface operates a deeper force, an inner drive that precedes logic and often commands it. This force is the will. It is a quiet insistence of desire, ambition, fear, and self-preservation. Reason frequently serves not as master, but as interpreter and defender of what the will already seeks. When power enters a human experience, this hidden hierarchy becomes more visible, because power feeds the will while flattering reason. Power expands possibility. It transforms wishes into executable realities. For the powerless, desire is limited by circumstance. Many impulses remain fantasies because they cannot be enacted. But when authority removes obstacles, the will experiences a new confidence.